So on this Easter Sunday, I am going to talk a little bit, of course, about Islam. Right? Just one aspect of Islam, really. And actually, I wrote some of this for the kids who are now gone. But I was going to explain to the kids that Islam is a religion. You probably know this already. Which is to say that it's a group of people that are brought together on shared values and beliefs and practices about how to live a good life. So we Unitarian Universalists are a religion. So is Islam. Now we have some different ideas, and that's okay. We are able to look at Islam and appreciate what is beautiful in it and reject what is troubling about it. And we invite them to do the same with us. So there's this woman who was born into Islam but has decided now to not be a part of it anymore. And her name is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And she was born in the small African country of Somalia, relatively small. She moved to the small European country of Holland and eventually was elected to the Dutch Parliament. And she is currently a fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. And the reason I know about her is because she's recently written a book called Heretic: Why Islam Needs a Reformation Now. I have not read the book. But I did hear her on the radio this past week, in fact, and she was discussing how she found her way out of Islamic dogma. And while the particulars of her story are her own, the broad strokes of it sounded really familiar. She said that when she was a little girl, an instructor asked her how somebody would differentiate her, a Muslim, from the other Christian girls at the school. She said it came down to practices around what was acceptable, which is called halal, and what is not, which is called haram. Halal and haram is how people would know that she was Muslim and not Christian. And these are part of Islam's dogma. Dogma means, this is for the kids, but it's probably a good refresher and good to have the how do I explain dogma to a 4-year-old card in your pocket. So this is how I explain dogma to a 4-year-old. Watch my lips. Dogma, where'd it go? Dogma means rules for what you believe and how you act because of those beliefs. You do not have rules for how you believe. But many religions do. Islam is one of them. And in the Islam that Ayaan Ali grew up with, if one fell into forbidden practices, well, then one was going to hell. One had offended Allah. If one practiced halal, one would go to heaven. The issue here, of course, was salvation and damnation. So for the Universalists in the room, some bells should be ringing. The issue behind the issue of salvation for Ali was the afterlife. So she thought to herself, do I believe in the afterlife? This is a big moment in her life. Do I believe in the afterlife? And for her, the answer was no. And so there was no longer any basis for her for halal and haram. And thus the entire underpinning of the dogma just fell apart. And she was freed of it. Now, she was not free from right and wrong. She was free of the dogma of halal and haram. And that important distinction will hopefully come into greater focus a little bit later. So I heard this interview it must have been Monday morning, in the midst of preparing for the UU history portion of our new member class. And the similarities between her story and our history have a powerful resonance. You see, the reason we are all here today has to do with the Universalist spring of our entwined tradition. And that spring had very much to do with thoughts about the afterlife. The Universalists said that no loving, all-powerful, all-knowing creator would create something only to see it tortured for eternity. That did not make any sense to them, and therefore they deduced that finally everyone, no matter what, is returned to the breast of the loving Creator. Now, if you accept that there is a loving Creator, this sounds only obvious to me. And of course, it was highlighted and sourced and underscored by the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. But most of the world did not like this idea. Not in Jesus' day, and not nearly 2,000 years later in early America. Universal salvation and forgiveness freaked people out. So one of the first things people said when our Universalist ancestors professed universal salvation was, hey, wait a minute, if everyone is going to heaven and no one bad is going to be punished by God, how is there any reason to be good? But this is a very confused thing to say. You see, the opponents of our ancestors thought that morality depended upon a heavenly reward or punishment. That moral behavior depended on the thoughts about an afterlife. Moreover, what determined reward or punishment in the afterlife was adherence to dogma in this life. So they could not separate morality from dogma. They thought that there was only one way to express the divine and only one way to be good. But we know that there are many ways to express the divine and many ways indeed of being good. Now, some folks just could not separate the ability to make good choices from the requirement to adhere to a particular belief or dogma until the Universalists came along, well, perhaps until Jesus came along. And then the Universalists picked up his message, continued it, and said, salvation does not depend on your choices. They said, you are saved just because you are alive by the grace of God. And now, because you did not have to adhere to dogma to experience reunion with the creative character of the universe, we were given the opportunity to open our hearts and our minds. The Universalists opened the mind of Christianity. My hope is that perhaps Ali can help open that part of the Muslim mind that is closed. That part that has to do with where she grew up. That strain. Because an open mind is a beautiful world. The mind of the Universalist Christian tradition opened like a flower opening. It expanded in scope and in application. And like a flower, the scent of it was sweet. Free of dogma, we opened our minds so that instead of only being about the afterlife, salvation widened in scope to be about all life. Free from dogma, salvation shifted from an after-death possibility to a present-day struggle. Salvation was about the economic situation and the current state of your spirit and character, not some picture after death. And today we celebrate this notion in our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of all people. If everyone is saved, so to speak, then everyone is born with inherent dignity. And that's also what this Easter story is about, when it ends in the empty tomb. At least this is how I read it. And I say that it ends in the empty tomb because the book of Mark, which is the gospel written closest to the time of the life of Jesus, ends in the empty tomb. Now, if you read it in your New Revised Standard Edition, you will find that you'll say, Pastor lied. There's a whole bunch of stuff after that. But that was an addition that was added sometime later. It was not written by the writer of Mark. You can tell that because of the language they use, etc. So the first gospel of the resurrection, so to speak, ends not with someone seeing the body or the man Jesus walking around after he died. It ends with nothing being in the tomb. The women went to the tomb to wash his body. They found the stone rolled away. They walked inside, and Jesus was not there right now. So that's how I read. That's the Easter story that I read. That's the one that resonates with me because, we're operating on a level of myth here also, so we can read it symbolically. So there's a place of death in the depths of the earth. The tomb was in a cave. So in the depths of the earth is this place of death. It's normally covered by a big, big stone, but when the ladies went with love in their heart to their departed friend, they found the stone had been moved away. Right? They did not open it themselves. They found it open. Inherently, you might say, this place in the earth had been opened. And when they stepped in, they found not the pain and death they expected, but rather a hopeful and compelling emptiness. This place deep in the earth, deep in our subconscious, was empty as a blank page of paper calling to your creative soul. The women went to the tomb expecting to find heartbreak and pain and death, but found it simply empty, occupied by none other than themselves, their living, breathing, creative selves, filled with the memory of their friend. They went to find Jesus, but instead found Christ. Because, of course, Christ, the renewing, forgiving, redeeming power of life, is not out there, is not someone else in someone else's body or someone else's responsibility. It's in here. The renewing, forgiving, redeeming power of life is in our hearts and is our responsibility to bring into full bloom. So the story of Easter is not about death or even life after death, but about the invitation to become the thing which we most yearn to be. It is about finding the Christ within, deep in the earth, about tending our pain with love and mercy and finding something open there, open and empty, and waiting for us to flower and bloom. So today, this Easter morning, we celebrate not the resurrection of a person, but the dissemination of a radical kind of personhood, filled with mercy and grace. Today, we celebrate not the resurrection of a body, but our embodiment of divine understanding. The Christ is the promise, not the person, but the promise of renewal, forgiveness, and redemption. The Christ is the promise of spiritual salvation, of letting go of fear. And that salvation is not out there, not beyond life, not after life, but within life, right next to you, in your relationships, in your responsibilities. It is planted within us by the grace of our being, a seed waiting to germinate and bud and bloom into a fearless opening. So if you've been coming at all regularly over the past year, you've perhaps noticed that I've been doing some work on this notion of salvation. I've been trying to make it relevant to our Unitarian Universalist present context and to build a systematic sort of proposition about it in that context. And so far, here's where we have walked together. That salvation is the freedom of living without fear. That freedom is found in our ability to respond rather than react. That fearlessness comes from faith. That faith is a story that guides our ability to respond, which is where we find freedom. And our story bears witness to the notion that we are all interconnected, that everything is interconnected, that we, each of us, are bestowed with inherent worth and dignity. That is our story. We are inherently worthy. That's what guides our faith, and our faith purchases our freedom. And before we do a thing, we know we are worthy. And that speaks to grace. Our interconnectedness means that my dignity and my worth is interconnected and bound up with yours. And that directs us toward compassion and mercy and forgiveness, and so right back to our inherent worth. Our universal salvation, our open minds and hearts freely given like a light that shines all around us. This is grace. Happy Easter.